Join the Ungovernables. No filters, no apologies. This season, we're cracking open Uniswap governance. Welcome to a new episode of the Ungovernable Podcast.
Hello, hello. Welcome to a new episode of the Ungovernable Podcast. Today we've got Doo Wan Nam, a co-founder of Stable Lab. They're at the forefront of DAO governance, designing systems and voting frameworks across protocols like Maker, Aave, Optimism, and of course, Uniswap. We are Joe and Austin from Alpha Growth, your premier DeFi ops and growth firm. Doo, thank you for being here. What else should everybody know about you?
Well, thank you so much for inviting. And yes, so my name is Doo. I'm a co-founder and CEO at Stable Lab, which is involved in more than 25 DAOs. I personally have been involved a lot into for Compound as well as Uniswap, and then also been contributing to Sky ecosystem since 2018. Many say that I've been there for a while. Maybe also means that I just haven't retired. But either way, it's been quite a fun journey. And I think that also really contribute to how I, as well as the team, think about governance as well. So happy to be here.
Absolutely. Yeah. And would love to start out with just a little bit of your personal journey. You were in the military and now you're in something that could not be further away from the military in terms of decentralized versus bureaucratic and centralized. So I'd love to hear from you how that all happened.
Yeah. So even actually before military, my background is in economics and also international affairs. So I actually been working a lot on the fixed currency. So for example, like Argentina, as well as like looking at Asian financial crisis and others. So when I finished my military service as an intelligence officer, I was looking at this entity, and then it was saying that they're looking for an asset that doesn't change value. And then I was like, okay, this seems a bit strange. And so I went to the interview. And then there's this person who I think he was probably a bit high on something, maybe. And then he was talking about how there's this person called Vitalik who might be an alien, but he is a genius. And then how this something called crypto is going to change the world. Now I'm thinking to myself that this person is quite crazy, but I have recognized that I myself am also a bit crazy. So this might be a good opportunity. So when I went there, he was mentioning that they have this thing called ETH, like Ethereum, and then he's thinking about having some kind of asset that's stable, that's backed by it. And I told him that it is technically possible. So I started working on it. And then later I heard about this project called Maker. And then of course so they asked me like, okay, there's this project called a Maker, like I think you should do some research regarding it. So of course, like I came back and said, oh, like their ideas are a bit similar, but at the same time, like we are better because our team had me, right? Fast forward, the company went bankrupt, but with that knowledge, I was able to write different blogs and also studies regarding stablecoin as well as Maker, which of course eventually was also the aspect that I ended up joining Maker DAO in around 2018. And then I started with helping with the Korean and Asian community, and then went to help with business development. Now, till then, I was not really interested in the governance aspect. Like I heard, for example, what happened on the DAO aspect, but as I was kind of looking from the foundation perspective, as you can imagine that what I thought what DAO does is that whatever that happens, there are people on the forum commenting some things, right? But of course, that completely changed when the foundation, when Maker Foundation dissolved a few years later, and then I started to contribute as a delegate myself. So then I saw that actually looking from the DAO perspective is very different from how you might look at from the inside the, let's say, foundation. So then we realized, okay, what are some of because I was both in as a foundation as well as as a DAO, like what would be some of the aspects that are really beneficial for both ecosystems, right? From both sides. So that has been kind of the journey, and that's also how Stable Lab has become this cornerstone for professional, not just for delegate, but for the governance services and participation.
If there was one stablecoin through all the years that you've seen, maybe it took off, maybe it didn't, and you could just snap your fingers and have this stablecoin be ubiquitous throughout the ecosystem, which one would it be?
Oh, you mean like that stablecoin to be very, very successful?
Yeah. If you could just pick one, what's your favorite? What's the one that you've seen that you appreciate or appreciate the design of the most, or just feel like it's?
I mean, of course, I'm very biased, and then it's possible that some of the members might be in the call as well here. So of course, I wish the USDS to be like the one, but I think that kind of serious looking into it, it was like throughout the journey, there were a lot of stable coins that were pitched, right? And then also like launched, and they also failed or succeeded. But I do think that there were a lot of good lessons learned. I mean, if you look at, for example, let's say USDS or previous DAI as well, there were actually a lot of lessons that were learned, right? Whether, for example, how to make it more stable, how to make it more scalable. But in terms of your question about what stablecoin would I like make it successful, I must say that USDS. But you can ask another question, which was what I thought was like most interesting stablecoin, of course.
Yeah, what was that?
So I think there were actually two that were very interesting, but one was Ampliford, which was actually not really a stablecoin, but at the same time was actually a quite interesting concept if you think about it, because especially back then, rebasing was something that was more in experiment territory. And then basically, I mean, eventually it was kind of shown that Ampliford itself is not so stable per se, but at the same time was one of those truly algo stablecoin that was just purely by supply and demand, right? So of course, it is very like speculative, so it doesn't really also fit the criteria for a large stablecoin. But at the same time, it was something that I have realized that it could actually work in terms of the concept. And then, I mean, it is scaled quite a lot. Of course, like nowadays, people don't talk about it, but I thought was quite interesting. Another one, of course, is the Terra. And then it was actually kind of interesting journey. For context, I'm from Korea, right? So I heard about Terra even before they kind of launched, and then as well as the founders, and as well as some of the journeys, as well as some of their difficulties. And then I remember that I was in DeFi community in Korea, as well as hearing their like struggle. And then one of the aspects that Doo Wan was communicating to his community was that beside the stablecoin setup and others, it's also the community and narrative that's very important. And then he was saying that they were not getting the narrative because when a lot of members, they look at, for example, Korean projects, they don't really think it like, high class, let's say US based projects that have like very, famous founders that are engaged in a lot of social media. And that is kind of true that back then, a lot of the Korean based founders, they were not so active in this kind of community. And Doo Wan, he really wanted to be active, and he really wanted to be like, for him was like, even if it creates controversy, he felt that was needed to basically make it interesting and make it basically gain that traction. Like from the setup side, there were a lot of, I think, criticism and also questions. I remember I myself also got a lot of like questions regarding it and gave my feedback. And I think that from their side, they genuinely had the kind of idea that maybe they can try to make it successful by being scalable. And I think there was a time that I think from the industry, I mean, because they were able to grow several billions, I think there was some thinking that like, okay, maybe they have reached this status, right? And I think that was kind of the same for a lot of the comments from the crypto Twitter that, okay, like in theory, they have those, let's say, aspects that might make it unstable, but because they have grown so much that maybe now they kind of reached the equilibrium. Of course, the history tells that that was not the case, but it was definitely a very interesting aspect, not just because of the setup, but also the how they at least thought stablecoin, not just as stablecoin itself, but as a community. So that was also very eye-opening. And of course, there were also a lot of both personal friends who were impacted by the fall because there were some that, for example, either invested or they had, in Anchor and those aspects. So that was also something that was very interesting.
I appreciate you diving in there. The stablecoin concept it's pretty unsexy, but I think it's so necessary. So it's good to have when, especially like you mentioned, the controversy is healthy for innovation because it invites engagement, and I think we need a lot more than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's actually a really interesting point. Like from the stablecoin perspective, is like I know that everybody likes to talk about the new narrative, right? Like, like for example, a few months ago, a lot of people are actually even before that, people are talking about AI a lot, right? They're like, okay, here's like AI plus the thing, and they're like crypto Twitter plus the AI, and then later they're like, okay, meme coins. The narrative always changes, and then now the kind of meme coin kind of died down a bit, and then now the people are looking into more DeFi aspects. They call it DeFi 3.0. At this point, it's a bit like a Windows. I don't know whether it's like a DeFi X or DeFi like 3.0 or 4.0. It keeps changing. But the point being that there's like a lot of new DeFi aspect that people are talking, as well as stablecoin, right? Like I think that stablecoin at the end of the day is still being one of the major use case. In fact, like not just within, let's say, crypto cycle, it is true that whether people use it as, let's say, payments or others, there are actually quite a lot of people who, for example, use not just USDS, but like USDC and also USDT across different world, right? So I think that like, I know that we like to talk about like what's the killer use case, but if you look around it, like stablecoin is one of those killer use case that's already been widely used. And then if you ask them, and both the partners, the others, like why they or users why they use them, it's very clear because it's much more transparent. It's also faster and it's also cheaper, right? Like especially in some of the banks or let's say countries that are very strict about it. Like it's one of the aspects that has been very, very appealing for them.
Yeah, it's definitely the backbone or one of the backbones of DeFi. So, I'm kind of curious what you're most excited about for, the DeFi 3.0, DeFi 4.0. What kind of narratives are you most excited about for DeFi coming up?
Yep. So, and I think that that's also tied to Uniswap as well. So, which is a nice transition.
There we go.
Right? So, so a lot of a lot of the DeFi aspects, of course, evolve over the years, and some of them are more gradual. But at the same time, what hasn't been tested too much, at least within the, especially DeFi on Ethereum, has been how much would be able to be like an app chain that's able to be very successful, right? So meaning that, like for example, for Sky, like let's say like previously Maker, although there were some discussions about Maker chain per se, like right now it's still based on Ethereum. Like Aave, for example, like is still like sure it's multi-chain, but you don't really, for example, hear about Aave chain itself, right? Or like for example, let's say in terms of like Compound, like I know that there was a discussion about Compound chain a long time ago, but right now at least like Compound has been more focused on the multi-chain aspects, and I know that you guys probably know it better as well. So a lot of times like DeFi still has been very dependent on either Ethereum or on other chains aspects. Now I think Uniswap is one of those cases where they're actually creating their own L2, so we actually get to see how much they can grow, right? Basically being the DeFi protocol with the good reputation and good brand and also a lot of users, and then having the L2. Now, I do understand that right now the TBL aspect itself is still in the process of growing, like it's not as high as others. But I think that especially once, let's say, those settles and then we have more time, it'll be a very interesting way to look at it because I do think that it tests some of the theories that people have been having, right? About like how much of the growth they're able to transition into their own chains, and then also how much autonomy they can also have. So that's, I think, one of the key changes in DeFi that I've been interested in. Another aspect that, of course, has been interesting in DeFi is, so I know that there are a lot of different members in the ecosystem that like to talk about some of the new fancy, complex theories. They might say, here's the option on top of option to on top of options. It's like a turtles all the way down there. Like it's cool, but at the same time, we have also realized that a lot of times the problem with people accessing DeFi is not necessarily that they don't have this complex mechanism, but rather that they don't really have a good way to access it. So some of the cool innovations I've been also seeing is of course about like how can people easily use it. In fact, so easy that they don't even realize it's a blockchain. That's actually the one of the key aspects, right? So some of them have been integrated directly into centralized aspects. So like even for example, let's say Coinbase wallets or Coinbase itself. Coinbase itself technically, of course, is not DeFi per se, but at the same time, if the users are able to interact directly with it, that's something that solves a lot of issue, right? Because Coinbase itself has a lot of users. So if the users are able to interact DeFi directly, that itself is something that's very beneficial. And there's also a lot of improvement in, for example, wallets and also access. I know that they, like the crypto Twitter like to say like chain abstraction and others, but I think at the end of the day, it's more about like, okay, what are some of the ways to really increase access? And I think that's something that has been very exciting because once again, the issue with DeFi is not necessarily the complex mechanism. It's more that how can people access it, right?
Yeah, we're starting to see the merge, between DeFi and CeFi. I know we're going to touch a lot on Uniswap, but just want to ask one question real quick: is why do you think UniChain is going to be such a game changer?
So I think that it's going to be game changer in both ways. Like meaning that of course it's a game changer in a way that it's, I think one of like, because technically there have been some others that are app chains, right? Like for example, DYDX used to be on Stockton and then they moved to their own chain on Cosmos. So technically there have been some examples, but even in, for example, case of DYDX was more that it was still based on L2 for at least like this Stocknet for a long time before going into their chain, right? So I think the UniChain is one of those examples that can really show to DeFi protocols what it could mean for to be like own app chain. So I think that it can potentially show that like, hey, like let's say that, like here's the example. Let's say that Uniswap or UniChain become very, very successful. And it's also able to capture a lot of the fees. They're also able to have a lot of autonomy. That could actually also spark other DeFi protocols and even like beyond DeFi protocols to really also pursue their own L2 strategy, right? Because it showed. I mean, it's a bit similar to how Coinbase related base was able to showcase to exchanges that having their own L2 can be very, let's say, game changer. So it'll be a bit similar category like that. Now onto just Uniswap itself, also will be game changer because Uniswap, of course, has been one of the most popular DApp. Also, people recognize it. Also, I think the pink unicorn is still a very good idea. So it's in a way one of those DApps that people are very like recognizable even outside crypto. So if, for example, they're able to grow market size via this, that's already very popular. I think that it also signals to others about some of the ways to basically utilize as a growth hack, right? Because then they will also recognize, okay, not just from, let's say, this like chain perspective, also from user perspective, it also can, because once again, what's one of the struggles for DeFi protocols? DeFi protocols, like usually not too many people use it. It's like per person, they do use quite a lot, but in terms of the users itself, it's still limited. So if this is a way for protocols to able to get more users and also have more visibility, then that's also something that's very going to have a lot of impacts.
What do you think is the threshold for individual apps such as Uniswap and Compound and Aave? What do you think is the threshold in which it would make sense for them to launch their own chain? It sounds like you're relatively bullish on the concept of UniChain, and you think there's fee capture, there's expanding their reach. What other types of protocols do you think are going to follow suit?
I think that a lot of protocols are definitely watching what's going to happen with UniChain, and I think the Uniswap community, so not just Uniswap Foundation, but I think the Uniswap DAO and many others are also kind of thinking the similar thing, right? Because I mean, you can imagine that, like, if, for example, Coinbase launched Base, and let's say that it was actually not as successful, then I think like, of course, we're looking at what if that kind of situation, but I think it definitely would have, like, I think they would like change a lot of the perspective we have, right? Because like, even now, when we talk with some of the, let's say, other L2s for other regions or or business related, like they always basically have it as an example, right? So I think in terms of threshold, I think it would be, of course, depends. But I think that ideally, what Uniswap will be able to show through UniChain would be that they're able to basically capture quite sizable TVL, right? And then not only that, what's important would be it's even more competitive or as competitive as the mainnet. So I think that's kind of the important point, right? Because, for example, if Uniswap, let's say on UniChain, is able to be more competitive than other chains that it's on, at least. Now, ideally, even more than Ethereum, but let's say at least like more competitive than some of the other chains that it's already on. That itself is actually a quite huge revelation, because that also means that, like, for example, of course, I don't speak for Aave themselves. I'm sure that like one day maybe you can invite Mark or Stani to speak, or maybe they already spoke, but you can imagine that for them will be also quite opportunity, because that also means that they're able to, for example, understand that like having their own might be also like have more users and also more competitive and have more autonomy to it. Now, I do want to give a caveat that this is actually not going to be easy, because for all the successful chains we know, there are actually a lot of unsuccessful cases, right? In fact, there are actually a lot of unsuccessful cases that we don't hear about or kind of fade away from the memory. And for those who might remember, like even for, let's say, exchange-related chain, when Binance was able to make it successful with the BNB chain, all the different exchanges, they launched their own like chain, like a smart chain, but only few of them were able to be successful. So I think that it's kind of important to be like, of course, like we have high hopes for it, and of course we also expect them to hopefully do well. But if it does well, I think that it's definitely going to have a big impact. If they don't do well for whatever reason, I do think that it's going to probably have another reminder that say, like L2 growth is very difficult, and also app chain L2 has its limits. So I think we'll have to see.
So you spoke quite a bit on the tech side and what you're excited about from a technical stablecoin, even, and you touched on the Uniswap UniChain side. How do you envision DAO governance evolving over the next few years?
So overall, I do think that it's going to be much more. So the caveat is that this is not bad or good, especially considering recent changes from the legal aspects. Is that like foundations are definitely going to be more active, and we're already seeing this across different DAOs. Like for example, for Arbitrum, already from the DAO side, they've been cutting some of the fundings, as well as trying to reduce some of the scopes. And then, like once again, this is neither good or bad, and I think that it also means that there are definitely some pros and cons, right? So for a lot of different DAOs, the reason why they also give the responsibility as well as some of the mandate and scope to DAO participants is also the aspect of resiliency, meaning that they want to ensure that it's more decentralized, and also ensure that, for example, those scopes can be taken over by some of the DAO participants. But generally, that comes with being inefficient, because as you can imagine, ideally, the most efficient way is to have this more like top-down approach, or like at least have a common communication, right? Like usually that's more efficient method. But basically the DAO approach is that even if it's a bit less efficient, you're able to execute it based on the fact that this is more decentralized. Now, and then decentralized can work in both, like, of course there are some that like the pathos of decentralization, but there's also some of them like this, whether that's through legal or other aspects. Now, the legal aspect definitely has been a bit less issue as time go, at least for now, based on what a lot of the members are thinking, like from both like different DAO participants. Now, it might be possible that that might change, but at least for now, like especially the US landscape has changed quite a lot. So that also means that now the foundations will feel more comfortable taking a bigger role. So that we're definitely going to see that. Now, then what does it mean
Real
for
quick,
DAO?
if I can double click on that, when you say the foundations are going to take a greater role, do you envision that as more of a centralizing responsibility and accountability?
Yes.
Okay.
So how I kind of imagine, and also it's already happening, is that so you can imagine that for now it was more or less the foundation has their mandate and scope, and some of the other aspects were, let's say, almost outsourced to DAO, right? So let's say DAO contributors, DAO working groups were working on it. What's likely to happen in the future is that those DAO contributors and working groups will work as a mandate or scope that's given from the foundation. So, like,
Mm,
because current structure is more like there's a DAO, and DAO gives the mandate and scope to the foundation, and it also gives the mandate and scope to the DAO participants, right? So, for example, let's say Uniswap is more like, hey, there's a DAO, like Uniswap DAO, there's Uniswap Treasury. From here, they have created the Uniswap Foundation and then gave them a scope and mandate, as well as they gave, for example, scope and mandate for example, Uniswap Accountability Committee and others, right? So this is kind of the structure where, hey, the mandate and scope has been given from the DAO. But what could happen in the future is that um, basically a foundation has more role and scope that instead of, let's say, these working groups being under the DAO, instead they're being under the foundation. So you can imagine that, let's say, the foundation says, I mean, so for this one, I'm not going to say for like Uniswap, but this is more for like in theory, right? So you can imagine that in theory, let's say the foundation decide, okay, now all the governance aspects will be under their mandates. And then they say, okay, and within the governance, we want to, for example, have working group that will be funding that, for example, wants to communicate with token holders, for example, right? Governance. So
gotcha.
so in the end, the work is a bit similar because at the end of the day, like for example, this working group, what they do will be similar to what, for example, happens in DAO. But you can imagine this, the big change will be then, well, who gets to decide, for example, this kind of initiative is worth it? And it's kind of likely that this kind of initiative will be more likely to be led by foundation rather than from the DAO governance.
Do you think we'll start to go more into like a hierarchical structure in that way?
Yes, and then I think that's already happening, and that's like both. I think that that's also kind of natural course as it happens as well, because I think that what happened was there are of course different type of DAOs, right? Like, and also some might argue that what is really DAO, and technically we can have like 5 years to talk about the definition as well as like talk about German philosophers, but at the same time, like what's I think important is that um, because we're also in an environment where there were a lot of experiments that happened with DAOs. And then what kind of happened was that there were definitely some issues that kind of arose. And then one of the, I think, the big issue was that DAO itself is very close to being a public good. Now, being a public good, as you know, has both good and bad. But it's also bad because unless there are like strong incentive to discourage it, there will be members that are trying to exploit the public good, right? Because that means that they're creating, basically it has a positive externality that nobody's really paying for. And then really the way to prevent that is either have a very strong rule of law and then also common understanding, or have basically an organization that stops it. And basically what happened across DAOs these days, and also what I heard from a lot of the members or others, is that they believe that um, because for DAOs, let's say, that allow it to just run by the DAO itself, that the mechanism to trying to prevent, let's say, this export of public good hasn't really happened too well. So that kind of also led many to be like, okay, either DAO basically sets up this, kind of guardrail to make it at least like watch what happens and also be careful, or the
Mhm.
foundation decides to take a more heavier role and be like, okay, um, we gave, for example, funding for this and then let the community decide. We came with the result that it was not as effective, therefore we'll be managing it from now. And I think this is actually kind of true if you look at a lot of the, I mean, I'm not going to name specific one because I owe them dinner or they owe me dinner. Not just kidding. But, but you can imagine that a lot of L2, like for example, incentive these days, some of them used to be, for example, run by the community and then now is run by the foundation. And once again, that's not, either good or bad. It just means that the kind of nature of it, right? They realize that, okay, DAO governance is good at making certain decisions, but when it comes to, for example, aspects that are more related to public good, maybe they're not so good at making decisions for it, right? So they decided, okay, this kind of scope and mandate, instead of giving it to the whole DAO governance, they decide to do it under themselves. So
do you remember hearing this quote about, I believe it was, I think it might have been Benjamin Franklin or FDR or something that said this, but sorry if they're listening, and I'm going to misquote one of them, but the quote has to do with the impermanence of democracy and how no democratic system can exist ad infinitum, because eventually everybody that's a part of the community and all the delegates basically will vote themselves largesse of the treasury, and then the democracy will fall, and then a tyrant will take over. What is the failsafe that DAOs need to put into place? Is it the foundation? Is that the checks and balances and the separation of church and state, or however you want to refer to it? Is that kind of what you're alluding to here?
So I do think that what happens is that, so I thought a lot about it, and that at the end of the day, this is more about the balance of power. But I think that a lot of times what a lot of people maybe misunderstand is that balance of power can be achieved. I mean, a lot of times I think that, this is more international like affairs, of course, relations. It's like people like to say, okay, balance of power means, for example, if there's a strong player A, then there's a strong player B or collision, and then they balance each other. That is one way to solve it. But actually, if you think about it, or if you study about it, another actually way to solve it is basically there's a superpower, or like basically there's a super majority or like decision maker who can keep the peace, right? And then ironically, that's also how some of the aspects are solved. And I know that, of course, when people mention like balance of power, it kind of means like having this delegate, both parties basically doing check and balances. But it is also true that in reality, this power is also kept by single autonomous, let's say, and also strong. It can be a group, it can be a coalition that's leading it, right? And then that itself is not necessarily bad. But at the same time, then you can ask like, okay, well, doesn't that, for example, mean tyranny? And not necessarily per se, right? Because once again, like let's say, for example, US, I'm not going to go into politics too much. Also, I'm Korean, so I cannot vote anyway, so it doesn't matter. But if you think about it, US in a way is a single power, right? Like, for example, if there's a problem and others, there's, let's say, central government. Yeah, of course, there's states. But at the same time, it is still United States, right? Like technically it can be divided into, let's say, different countries within United States to like check and balances, but no, it's like the United States and there's a law and there's Supreme Court and others, right? And then what I'm trying to say is like, well, that example doesn't really make sense. Well, my point would be, well, technically it's a one group called, let's say, United States, but within it, there's a Congress. And Congress is composed of many different members and they do check and balances within, right? So it's a bit like that where like you can have a very strong aspect, but you might have a check and balances within to ensure it. So for example, let's say a foundation decides to take more active role. Now, from the outside perspective, we might say, well, that's like single entity, so therefore that's a tyranny. But at the same time, you can also imagine that as long as, for example, within the foundation, there are perspectives that can provide both, then that could be okay, right? So for example, within, let's say, a foundation, it might be also possible that either they decide to have, hey, how about then we also have DAO perspective into our decision, or have somebody from the DAO to have the communication channel, and then they also can influence it. Or it can also possibly be that like even if there's no DAO participant per se, if there's like different perspective that can be provided within the foundation, then that is also some form of check and balances. So I know this is a bit unorthodox way of thinking about it, but that also can be something that's actually rational as well.
Well, there's also the issue that I see is that a lot of people look at traditional government models and traditional financial models and they say, no way, we can't do that. It's too similar to the way that it is in the, currently in the traditional systems and the centralized systems. And the reality is it's not one or the other. It can be both. It can be, let's take the best part of both systems and let's implement it. And so it sounded for a minute there like you were alluding to the fact that DAOs should elect presidents. Was that totally off base of me to to hear that?
Well, I guess my kind of perspective is like it can be president, it can be coalition, but I guess my point being that like it's possible that there's basically like a single entity or power, which itself from the outside might be seen as tyranny, but inside can be, for example, or like can be considered as a single point of, let's say, power, but inside actually can be check and balances. So I think that's a bit different perspective where, because we like to say, let's say there's like foundation having a strong control over it. We like to say, well, this foundation is basically being less tyrannical or aspects, but at the same time, it's also possible that within the foundation to have the checks and balances as well. Like in a way that this power balance is not necessarily have to be like completely like, I think the good way to think about it is like people ask how is the, people talk about peace and war, right? Like, there's like wars everywhere. What's the way to, for example, prevent wars? And some people might say, well, the way to prevent war is to basically ensure that they are balanced, like checks and balances. But if you think about it, actually another way to maintain peace is have absolute hegemony, right? So like you can imagine that like if, for example, this is like the real world, if, for example, somebody tries to, let's say, invade somebody, and then their country will be completely, like destroyed by a third party that's kind of overseeing the peace. Okay, well, that itself is also absolute hegemony that's keeping the peace. And that also is potentially possible. Like, if there's a, let's say, single entity that has absolute power, or at least like a sway, and is able to, for example, like, watch over, let's say, this public good, whether that's DAO treasure or others, that itself technically is also a way to preserve this, whether that's, resources or others, that also can be an option. Now, it's of course like, I would say it can be a bit controversial aspects. And then I think that it's definitely something that from the governance or from at least like crypto aspects, like don't think about it. But it is definitely also a way to, for example, preserve continuity as well. And especially if you think about some of the, let's say, L1's aspects, I know that some of the like participants might criticize them as being more centralized, but at the same time, they also have some of the benefits, right? They say they're more efficient, they're able to channel their resources more, they're also able to respond to emergency, faster. So once again, like there are both pros and cons, but at the same time, like it also can be one of the feasible way, basically.
So in the context of DAO decision making, what's looked at from the outside perspective, right? We all know that there are cartels and cabals and all that mess that goes on, and everything will always corrupt. But the delegate working group, for instance, or the delegate reward program that you were a part of, would you mind speaking a little bit to that and maybe some of your controversial opinions about how delegates should be or should not be compensated based on what they do and don't do?
Yeah, sounds good. I must admit that the proposal itself, like for example, compensating delegates was controversial for many reasons. And I think that there's actually a lot of confusion among delegates as well. And I think that maybe it also reflects on some of our philosophy and my philosophy as well. Because especially for Uniswap delegate program, it has changed over the years. But some of the aspects were like because especially for the cycle 2, it was very favorable toward some of the newer delegates, because for old delegates they had to basically vote constantly, and then for new delegates they were able to kind of start fresh, and then for example even like start recently, and if they voted pretty constantly they will be basically having higher points. And I think that this was also related to that there's definitely power aspects that can corrupt if not unchecked, or even if it's like within, like at least giving the opportunity, right? So but I say before that, I think that it'll be good to just talk about the program itself, right? So for Uniswap especially, is one of the oldest DAOs. People probably remember that they were able to get Uniswap airdrop by interacting on Uniswap a long time ago. In fact, you can still claim it technically if you find it somehow. I know there are some friends who accidentally find wallet that use Uniswap and they still claim it and able to participate, right? And then there have been a lot of different delegates that participate in governance for Uniswap for a long time. Now, for many years, there was, of course, the discussion about having compensation or like reward program for delegates, but every time it was a bit delayed, and we're also aware of it, that it was delayed because they felt it was not ready or there were some details that they want to have. And I think that's always kind of true, right? In a way that the program, of course, is very appealing to delegates, but it takes a longer time to try to convince the DAO and also other participants. And that was also true that when we looked at the landscape, and then we also believed that it was really needed because it's one thing that people can disagree whether delegates should be paid or not, but it can be also argued very easily that for proposals that people are supporting, it's important to ensure that quorum is met. Now, what that kind of means is that you can imagine that, let's say I know that I shouldn't really give really good examples, but let's say that like in real politics, if you think about it, there are politicians, right? They're congressmen, and they go to Congress and they vote. But imagine a case where basically the voting is not going because the congressmen just don't show up, and then or there's just like not much interest, right? So then it can be a problem that for the proposals that is actually beneficial for the community is not going through because of the quorum issue. And it also brings another aspect of like there could be potentially malicious votes that goes through because there are not enough people checking, right? Because if there's a malicious proposal, delegates or governance participants are supposed to give comments, and also if it goes to the voting, vote against it. But if they're not enough, then this is more likely to happen, right? And we already saw this with some of the other DAOs that happen. So in this regard, then it makes sense that we need to have a program to incentivize delegates. So before actually there was the Uniswap delegate reward program, what actually happened first was to have a Uniswap delegation program. So what that means was that we have recognized that a lot of the key VCs and investors who held Uni, they were actually not really keen to redelegating. So for example, let's say that they delegated them at the beginning of, let's say, Uniswap token launch, and many years later, a lot of those delegates who got a lot of delegation, they haven't voted for many years because they're busy, right? You can imagine that they might have voted for first year, and then they're like, well, there's no compensation. I'm so busy. This is above my pay grade, and they just don't do it. But in theory, then those investors should be redelegating these to delegates who are active. But that doesn't happen, right? And then we have also asked them, as well as like others have asked investors and also other participants why. And there are like many different reasons, and it can range from what is like a legal to logistics to simply that they're too busy, and or to simply that they don't really think that's a big part because they think the price itself speaks, right? So there are many different reasons, but one thing that's for sure is that they're very, very not flexible when it comes to redelegation, right? In theory, they should be delegate once delegates that they delegate to is not active. This is almost like imagine that you elected a congressman and this congressman doesn't really show up to even go vote. Well, then this person either could be removed because of law or get replaced next time. But because in DAO governance, such rules are now so clear, so that means that a lot of times you might have new delegates who are active, but they're not getting the delegation because they should be getting the new delegation because they're like active and in theory also participating, but they're not because
how often
also,
in a perfect world, what would you say, how often should there be some sort of delegate race go on? Is it every 3 months, every 6 months, every 12 months that call it the foundation of the DAO basically emits more delegation from the treasury?
Oh, well, I think that more aspect is a bit different. Like for example, right now, so Tane team, which is another delegate, has been also discussing with some of the other delegates to prepare the next phase for this Uniswap delegation program. And for them, they suggested 18 months but with the expiration. I think that anything that's around the year or so makes sense. Now, you might wonder, like, okay, why can't we, for example, do 3 months or 6 months? And that's partly because, a lot of those who are, there's definitely some consistency to it, because once you have elections too often, then those delegates also need to prepare and like compete, right? So of course you want them to compete, but you also want to balance out between like having it too frequent, because you you also don't want them to just focus their time just on the competing aspects for the races per se, right? But for this, so right now it's 18 months, but ideally, at least from the delegators, they should be able to reconsider their delegation like every year. I think is ideal. In reality, it doesn't really happen. And even, for example, when Uniswap had the delegate race, like actually the delegation from a lot of the top VCs were still kind of limited. I mean, yes, there were some that happened, but like afterward, like that was many years ago, right? And then that hasn't happened. And even, for example, there's a new one that's happening. I don't think that it will be as active either. So I know that we kind of went too back, but basically the idea was like even before the reward, it was important to ensure that delegates who are active and also acting in good faith were basically given more voting power. Now, the reason why that's also important is that then it's also able to help to meet the quorum, right? And also ensure that the governance goes through. And also it's a very important aspect that we're able to show that back then there was no Uniswap delegate reward yet, but they were able to vote very consistently, right? Basically the idea was like, you basically give more responsibility and give more voting power to delegates who are willing to be more active and also want to act in good faith, and that we're going to have a positive response. So that was also the aspect or basis that we're able to use to say, hey, so there are these delegates who are being active, and also many of those delegates have been active for many, many years. So they also deserve to get rewarded for it. Now, of course, there were a lot of aspects that were people against and others. And the thing is that the good thing about democracy is that everybody's wrong, and you realize that you yourself are wrong. So technically, everybody's wrong. But at the same time, there's comes to some kind of consensus, right? So that's also why that a lot of the aspects for Uniswap delegate program for reward is mostly objective. And the reason why I say mostly is there are still some parts that technically can be subjective, and we try to make objective as possible. But as German philosophers can tell you, technically that itself can be subjective, right? So we try as much as possible, but that's also the reason why the program is set like that at the moment.
So, dude, just so to understand a little bit better, for some of those metrics that you consider when qualifying a delegate as active, what are some of those metrics that you look at?
Yes. So there are definitely like three main aspects. Now, I think I'll start. I mean, so for the voting history itself is the major part. Now, of course, I got a lot of questions like, why does that matter? And then the good example that we talked about was kind of the congressman. Or if you think about it, if the reason why somebody got a delegation is to delegate, like represent their position and let their position know, then this delegate, not, for example, voting at all, means that he's not actually exercising what he's supposed to, right? Or she's supposed to. So it's possible. Well, the question I get is like, well, then they could technically not vote to make a statement. That is true. But that's also why there's a thing called abstain, right? Like there's a voting called abstain. So technically, if they want to basically make a statement by not voting, they can vote to abstain. And also what's important is that they have to then explain also their decisions, why they're abstaining or like they're voting against, right? And then, so the reason why the voting itself is important, as well as having this kind of habit or like having this culture of having a rationale, is also because delegates are human beings as well. And also, they might vote something and have a wrong understanding, right? It also happens to me sometimes that I thought that this proposal covers this, then this. And then at the same time, like it comes out that actually it was not, right? So, or it's possible that maybe I'm voting against it, or somebody's voting against it because he killed somebody's cat, who knows, right? So it's important to actually, let the committee know so they can challenge if needed. So that's the voting part. And then the second part of the proposal is also important because good proposals that have passed are also beneficial for the protocol's growth. So, and then also development, right? So it's also important that delegates were active in drafting proposals. That the reason why the important part is passed is because if it's like spams and didn't pass, then it shouldn't count, right? So that's another important point. The last point, which is I think the not as important others, is like other ways that they contributed, whether that's through the calls or whether they attended, for example, at the workshops to better improve it. Because once again, beside voting and also beside making proposal, there's also other ways to contribute to DAO. So that's why these have been in there for past few cycles. Now, cycle 3 has changed a bit, but the logic kind of applies.
I want to double click into the protocol growth piece here and how that is it's more than just important. But in your opinion, when you try to balance sustainability and innovation, how do you think about risk management versus aggressive growth and experimentation in the DAOs that you work with?
So it's actually much easier to justify growth. That's also the rule, I think, in DAOs as well, because DAO technically can be very, very sustainable, but eventually it's going to die out because it's such a competitive society. Like it's such a competitive environment, right? Like, for example, we talked about stablecoins a lot earlier, like today. And yes, there are a lot of stablecoins that grew a lot and then faded. But there are actually a lot more stablecoins or a lot more DeFi that people don't even know about because they were not even able to do experiment or have basically keep innovating. And then one aspect that like even back at Sky that we talk about is that it's important not to feel content. And then the reason why that's important is because we learn from our experience, right? Because there was a time that Maker, like for example, previous code Maker, used to account for 90% of DeFi. But then I remember we were always having this, kind of discussion about there was a time that Nokia used to take over the world. Now people don't really talk about Nokia. There will be always somebody in the call say they still like Nokia, and I understand it, but that was not the point, right? The point being that unless you continue to innovate and also try new things, there will be some other competitors, and also there will be more and more like, let's say, market changes, and like the system wouldn't be able to be as flexible or have like a different aspects. So that's why I think it's quite important to have those experiment aspects. Now, of course, with the caveat, I know I say caveat quite a lot, but at the same time, it is also important that experiments also have the aspect of knowing what is the delivery and then what is the expectation, as well as like what are some of the other plans, right? Because experiment for the sake of experiment is not as helpful as, for example, experiment that will be able to grow this and that. I think that one of the good example that I can address, I know this is a bit less on the Uniswap aspect, but like for example, Sky perspective was the RWA, which literally costed millions to trying to build it, but was able to grow much more. And as a DAO, we knew that it was very risky, but at the same time was able to basically test it, learn the lessons. Some of them defaulted, okay, and they learned the lessons, and how can we prevent that in the future? That is same for Uniswap as well. Like Uniswap has different experiments, and whether that's, for example, grows through like let's say marketing perspective or growing through let's say these grants or others, like basically how can, for example, DAO learn from it and improve from it, I think will be the key aspects.
Yeah, and just to double click there, who do you see as like responsible for experimenting and creating that sustainable growth? Is that like DAO? Is that the foundation, or is that labs?
I think that that's actually like can be all of them, and then also I think that it can be something that because it's not mutually exclusive, right? Like one of the examples that we talk about is like so GFX, which is another delegate in Uniswap, they had a lot of proposals that were actually able to grow further, right? Like they had, for example, a lot of the multi-chain proposals they have. They also previously had some of the new fee structures they had, and they were actually able to grow revenue for the whole ecosystem. And they are not from the lab themselves. They are DAO participant. Of course, they got grant from the foundation before. So you can imagine that this is also kind of the collaboration aspects, and then also where like ideas can come from everywhere. I think what's important, of course, is to ensure that whatever the experiment and growth there is something that has some consensus, or even if it's not consensus, then somebody's willing to, even if somebody needs to push through it, basically be responsible for it. Like, for example, if the Uniswap Foundation says that, hey, like we're the ones that want to really take charge, that's also fine, but they also need to take responsibility for it, right? So that's kind of how I think about it.
As the protocol evolves, what else does Uniswap need? What are the biggest holes in the game?
So as the protocol grows, there's definitely going to be aspect for like once again, growth is good, but at the same time, then you need to prepare two things, right? What happens if the plan fails? I think is kind of important because, and also that has been actually one of the big downfall for a lot of DAOs is that, yes, you need to grow further, but not having the risk analysis, not just from the protocol risk analysis, but let's say like that's from because even for traditional companies, they have different plans, right? What if their new product doesn't sell well? Well, you also need to have a plan, right? So I think that's definitely the aspect that I think Uniswap as a DAO and as well as overall needs to kind of think about is like, how can we make sure that this is more sustainable, ironically by growing, right? Like you grow, that's fine, but at the same time, how can we make it sustainable? Like sustainable growth aspect, I think is a key aspect. Also, another aspect that's going to be important, especially with the new UniChain, would be like, okay, now they launch it, everybody knows it. Okay, how can you make it successful, right? And I think that this is also where like it's a combination of both business, marketing, as well as like developers and others. It's like, okay, because now the genie's out of the bottle, right? You cannot really, I mean, technically you can, but now you have to grow it and make it successful. So I think that will be kind of I shouldn't say like missing part, but it's something that will definitely be in effect. And we already know because like, for example, there's already passed a proposal to incentivize UniChain, and also the foundation has several plans. So I think that this will definitely happen.
Dude, I got a fun question for you. If you had total control of the Uniswap DAO treasury, you were delegated, 41 million uni, what would you do?
I would probably delegate away.
Who would you delegate it to?
I mean, so in case, I mean, actually, this actually happened in some of the. I mean, I know this is like beside this point, but there are some of the DAOs that happens, right? Where like we do have like majority aspects or like more than double the power of other delegates combined happens sometimes. But at the same time, like then it's important that we recognize the responsibility of power, right? Because it is true that absolute power is more likely to be corrupt. So in such cases, it's better to be a coalition than being a single person. Because once again, so when we talk about let's say if it's Uniswap Foundation leading it, they need to be responsible for it, right? Like it's important that if you have a great power, then you're responsible for it. Mm-hmm. And in such case of let's say us having majority of power for deciding everything, I think that what's important would be then we have basically members that are helping the DAO and able to grow together. Now, is there a case that like I do think that there's very like sometimes rare cases where it can be used to safeguard against like malicious aspects. I think there are some DAOs that, for example, they're guardians that are acting just for that. Of course, when we talk about Uniswap, I think that it's more likely that what's going to happen is that, okay, like we're going to try to divide it up. And then because we also, generally believe that if we want, and then that is our goal, like we're going to aim for it, but that was never really the goal from our perspective.
Gotcha. Yeah, with I guess it's with great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah, that too.
When you're getting delegated 41 million uni.
Yeah, I mean that too, and we always like to say that it's we also always like to say it's the journey that counts, right? It's the governance journey and the PTSD we share that is important.
Yes,
collective.
Dude, we've always really enjoyed your based commentary on the forums. Where else can people follow your work?
So they can follow me on my Twitter, where I sometimes post a lot of the interesting but can be a bit Korean humor. Can be dry, but also is funny. They can also, of course, follow our Stable Lab Twitter, and then also can see our action on the Uniswap forum as well. Sometimes can be controversial, but at the same time, like that's the point of this podcast, right? So
Absolutely. No, you're spot on. We'll go ahead and wrap up here. Doo, thank you so much for the insights. This is another episode of the Ungovernable Podcast. For our listeners, please follow Doo and follow us at Grow Uniswap to stay up to date. New episodes every week. And don't forget to subscribe on Spotify and YouTube. This is the Ungovernable Podcast. We are Joe and Austin of Alpha Growth. See everybody next week. Thanks again, Doo.
This was the Ungovernable Podcast by Alpha Growth. Watch all our episodes on YouTube or Spotify or weekly live on X.